I want to start this video off by making it very clear that I do enjoy Infinite's Infection. Despite the issues that I will bring up, there's a lot I do enjoy about the mode, and I'll go over some of that in the video too. But anyway, in today's video we're going to be going over what I believe the problems with Infinite's Infection are, and how I would improve or change upon them. Yes, some of these issues are probably entirely based on my preference, and some of you might have an entirely different opinion on the matter. And if that is the case, then let me know down in the comments. Regardless, without wasting any more of your time, let's jump straight in. Infinite did things a little bit differently to prior incarnations of the game mode. Now it still keeps the overall same formula, you have 12 players, 2 starting infected, but there seems to be a few differences in how the mode actually functions. Overall, it's probably closest to the version we had in Halo 5, but even then I wouldn't say the two are exactly the same. Survivors start with a Bulldog and a Commando, which to be fair makes sense, the Bulldog is the primary shotgun in this game, and the Commando is also a decent starting choice too. Personally, I do think the Bandit would be the better fit, as it functions very similarly to the Halo 5 Magnum, but maybe that's just down to the speed the infected move at, so they chose the Commando instead, especially with it having a little bit more ammo in its magazine. As for the Alpha Infected, they start with a Shroud Screen. This was obviously the piece of equipment added last season, and it's basically a smoke grenade, but alongside this, if you're starting infected, you can also crouch to access active camo. And as long as you're crouch walking, this will remain permanent. There is a few people that I know that aren't a huge fan of this, but I think it works pretty well, especially for the sake of balancing. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're crouching, you can't exactly move very quickly, and the survivors all spawn with threat sensors, so it's pretty easy to detect where some of the infected are, especially on some of the smaller maps like Aquarius. Survivors do spawn with a very minimal amount of ammo. The Bulldog only comes with 6 shots, which isn't even a full drum, and the Commando does spawn with 20 bullets, which is a full magazine, or clip, or whatever. I'm not a gun nut, I don't really know the technical terms, but you get my point. Now, you would assume, based on the very limited quantity of ammo survivors spawn with, that you'd have to do a lot of scavenging in order to be able to survive. The thing is, you kind of spawn next to weapons and ammo crates most of the time. There's a few different ways that you can find weapons or ammo. Obviously, there is weapon drops scattered across the floor, and these usually don't have full ammo. If it's an energy-based weapon, it'll probably only have 25 or 50% ammo, and weapons that have to be reloaded usually only have a single clip. There is power weapon spawns, and these can sometimes range from weapon variants such as the Striker Sidekick or the Backdraft Cindershot, or just normal power weapons such as the Spanker or Sniper Rifle. The thing is, these always pretty much have full ammo, and I don't really think some of these weapons belong in Infection. Something like the rocket launcher, if you're last man standing, you have infinite ammo, so now you have access to a rocket launcher with infinite ammo. Granted, there is still a window of opportunity for the infected when you have to reload, but still, I do think some of these weapons are very overpowered for what you're dealing with and don't really belong in the mode. That also applies to the stationary turrets that are on certain maps like Forest or Chasm. The turrets do not belong in Infection. If they're stationary, they have full ammo. If you dismount them, they still have a lot of ammo. Well, I mean, when they're stationary, it's infinite, but you are limited by your movement. You can't really turn all the way around. But like I say, when you dismount it, it's basically still full. And this just isn't fair for the infected to deal with, especially on something like Chasm, which I believe actually has 2 turrets, and I think Forest has 2 as well. It just gives you easy access to a very powerful weapon that respawns, I believe. I think the turrets respawn. And overall, I just really think it damages balancing. That's not to say the game mode is hard for the infected. As long as you have a bit of strategy, then it's still very easy to overcome the survivors. Except almost every round you'll be stuck with at least 4 bots, because most players just leave the second they become infected. Granted, that one isn't really a mode issue, that's more of a player skill issue. But anyway, just backpedaling a little bit and going back to the weapons, I do think overall some of the spawning is just a bit janky. And even then you have power equipment like Overshield and Active Camo, and I think these respawn every 30 seconds, which means a survivor can just constantly pick up Active Camo and hide the entire round, which is really lame. And there seems to be a bug at the minute too, when you're last Spartan standing, if you have camo, it doesn't tell the infected where you are like it normally should, which means you can just hide. As long as you're not shooting the infected and they don't spot you, you will win with no issue. And you'll probably actually get more points for doing that, which brings us on to our next issue, and that is the scoring. You get a point pretty much every second you survive an infection, and most of the time, as long as you survive the entire round, you'll probably finish with over 200 points. I do think overall it feels way too generous for survivors and not generous enough for the infected. You do only get 5 per kill as a survivor, and obviously you get the points for surviving. I think you get extra points for being last Spartan standing. And these all make sense, but I do think the scoring for surviving does need to be lowered a little bit. It just kind of rewards you for camping, which I'm not a huge fan of. Obviously, I do understand the objective is surviving. I'm not going to dispute that in any regard, but I do think you should still be rewarded more based on your actual skill and not just how long you hid in a corner. Just for an example, I had a match where I had, I think, 24 kills as survivor, and the person behind me, the second most kills in the lobby, was someone with 12. They just survived longer than me, and we pretty much finished the game with the same score, despite the fact I had double his amount of kills. It's not like this is Capture the Flag or something too, where it's technically like an objective-based mode like that. I feel like getting kills still falls into the theme of surviving. There's also the issue that you only get 10 points per kill as the infected, which means if you're the alpha infected, you're going to be at a massive disadvantage on the leaderboard, as you just simply can't get as many points as most other players. You can try and prevent them from getting more points by killing them, but this isn't always that easy. Personally, I think the infected should get 15 to 20 points per kill, and the alpha infected should get more points if the infected win that round. I think every player gets 10 points when the infected win as long as you are infected, but I do believe alpha infected should get maybe 20 to 30 points. And yeah, probably about 15 per infection. As for survivors, I just think the scoring needs to be toned down a little bit for the surviving. And as I mentioned, I feel like there needs to be some changes to the weapon spawning, mostly just removing some of the power weapons, definitely removing the turrets or at least toning them down. There should probably only be 1 turret per any map that has them, and they shouldn't respawn at all. But I think my next main issue with Infection is the map pool. I don't think some of the maps are best suited for the mode, or at least with some of the starting equipment. Something like Aquarius, that is a very small and narrow map, and since survivors all spawn with 4 threat sensors each, it can be very difficult at times for the infected. It's very easy to detect where they are. Now, because you are limited on movement, this means the infected can in some instances have the advantage, as they're very quick, so it's very easy for them to close that distance. But you can also make it a very tough time for them if you know where the alpha infected initially spawn. I'd argue the easiest time to kill a survivor is at the beginning of the round, as that is when they have the least amount of ammo and they're all a bit more scattered across the map. As long as you've played enough Infection, you pretty much know where the alpha infected spawn every round, and it's pretty easy to just pick them off straight away, giving the survivors a bit more time to group up and gather more ammo. And again, just using Aquarius as an example, it has a really lame hiding spot, which is the vent under the map, where the infected actually initially spawn, but you can only really get in if you crouch or slide in, so it can be very difficult for the infected. When they do have large numbers, it is pretty easy to breach this area, but if there's a bunch of survivors in here, it can actually just be a chore for the infected and can make it extremely unfun. Chasm is also another great example of a map that I don't think suits Infection very well. I think it's a fun map overall. I do like Chasm. I know it's not the most loved by the community, but I think for Infection specifically, it doesn't really belong in the playlist. One major reason is down to the weapon spawn. I already mentioned the turrets, but there's also again some lame camping spots, and it can also be very hard to actually navigate as the infected with how quickly you move. It is really easy to just slip off the map, especially on some of the hexagon pillars which survivors might be standing on top of. You might try to jump on top of that and you'll actually just end up slipping off. I also had a really funny match the other day where there was like 2 survivors left. One of them was on top of this hexagon pillar, and I kid you not, at least half of my team, half of the infected, all fell off the map at the same time trying to jump up to this one player. I would argue that this is just a skill issue, but with how frequently it happens, I do think it is a design flaw with the map. I would really love to see 343 implement either some Forge maps that they've made or some community-made Forge maps into Infection. I also find it really weird that we don't have an Infection version of Solitude, which, if you don't know, is the recent Plaza remake. I think aesthetically it would fit Infection really well, and a few tweaks and changes, it could actually be a really solid Infection map. Obviously, I understand it's designed much more for competitive play, but I do still feel like it could have a place in Infection. But again, despite that, I do think it would be worth considering adding some community-made Infection maps, as some of these would be designed specifically for that mode. Obviously, the maps that are in Infection have been modified to try and better suit it, but I do think some of these just don't really belong in the playlist. I think Street is actually one of the best ones, and that's coming from someone who usually doesn't enjoy Street, but I think Streets on Infection is great. I love the extra streets that are opened up that you can go down, and I think overall it's very well designed for Infection. But some of them just aren't great for the mode, and they can be very, very tiring to play. especially the ones that have much easier camping spots like Forest, Aquarius, and Behemoth. I think my next and final main issue with Infection is just the lack of variety. We only really have one Infection game mode, and usually in some of the other Halos, if you go Master Chief Collection especially, you'll see that there's a ton of variations in the Infection playlist. You'll have something like Creeping Death or Save One Bullet, and I would like to see Infinite receive some other variants of Infection in the actual Infection playlist. Obviously, I understand the mode is still relatively new, so I'm not going to complain too much in that regard that there isn't a ton of variety, but considering we have had to wait for a while, I would like to see it come sooner rather than later. Give me something akin to Creeping Death, where the infected are slower but have full camo and swords and hammers. Maybe even a classic Infection game type, where it sort of removes most of these armor abilities, and potentially changes the weapons that the survivors spawn with. I would argue the Bandit would be a much better choice than the Sidekick because of how quick the rate of fire of the Sidekick is and how quickly it can tear through infected. And then they could just really experiment with some of the things that Infinite has with its sandbox. Imagine how terrifying a version of Infected where all the Infected have grapple shots would be. That would actually be insane. And I would also love to see a big team version of Infection where maybe there is 4 to 6 starring Infected and a bunch of survivors on big team battle maps. I think that could be a lot of fun. I mean, imagine being the last Spartan standing and there is 23 Infected charging at you. It would be amazing. But yeah, overall, I think that does sum up all of my issues with Infection. Again, some of these I do think are personal preference, but I know a few people do share some of these problems too. I just want to reiterate, I do enjoy Infection. I do think it's a pretty solid game mode, it's very fun, it's pretty casual sometimes, but it does have a few flaws which I do think are going to really damage the mode's reputation and can genuinely harm the experience overall. I like the usage of some of the equipment. I think it's cool having access to stuff like the Quantum Translocator, the Shroud Screen, the Threat Sensor, and I think a lot of the other stuff is done pretty well. I like having these new open areas on the maps in an official playlist. I think it is cool seeing the underbelly of Behemoth and these extra areas in some of the maps, but I do think some of them just aren't really designed for Infection. But anyway, we are going to wrap things up there. Let me know what you all think down in the comments. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you all in the next one.